Pleasure to be with you this morning. Let's see, is this too loud or do I need to turn one of these off? I'm hearing myself echo a little bit. I'll talk a little softer. It's good to be with you this morning. It's good to be able to visit you from time to time. And I got kind of a unique experience this time around because I was up in Oak Ridge last week preaching a gospel meeting there. And I've always known for a long time that folks from Oak Ridge come down and they visit quite a bit. Several of them preach here on a regular basis. But I'll tell you this, this congregation is well loved by that congregation, as I know you know. But you guys come up in conversations with folks pretty regularly, not just the Wades, but a bunch of people. And they speak very admiringly of everyone here with a great deal of love. And it was just nice to see that connection between congregations that I know has existed for such a long time. And so that encouraged me, and I appreciate not only the opportunity to be here this morning, but the ability to see that and how special you are to them and they are to you. Open your Bibles to Genesis chapter 4. Genesis chapter 4. And we're going to talk a little bit this morning about Cain and Abel, mostly about Cain, and about the second sin. This story is kind of interesting because it details a great deal of wickedness on Cain's part. But when we talk about sin in the book of Genesis, typically what we're talking about is going to be Adam and Eve's sin, because that's where sin enters into the world. That's where the problem begins. And, we tend to, at least I do, when I'm talking to people about the gospel story, I'll tell them about Cain or about Adam and Eve's sin. We'll talk about Cain and Abel very briefly, right on the way to the flood. You get to the flood, and then you get to, rebuilding the world after that, and then to Abraham, and then you jump all the way to Jesus. And there's so many parts of the Bible you just kind of fast forward through. And this can be one of those because once you've talked about Adam and Eve's sin, you kind of understand sin. But Cain, in particular, is very unique and very scary in that what we see in that second generation of human beings is a sharp escalation in what sin is and in its effects. With Adam and Eve, we see some dire consequences for what they did. They were cast out of the garden. They became mortal, but we don't actually even see their deaths until a little bit later. And as far as we know, by the time chapter 4 begins, Adam and Eve are still alive, and they're still the parents of Cain and Abel, and they're alive after this story that we're going to talk about today ends. And so, we haven't really seen the devastating effects of sin yet, but we do see them when Cain murders Abel. And so this escalation should worry us because we realize, if we're looking through this kind of from a fresh perspective, that, sin is worse than we thought. It's not just losing communion with God, but there are other effects to this. And it's not just taking a piece of fruit and rebelliously eating it either. It can get a lot more violent. And it's not just exile from God, but it can be exile from other people as well. And so everything gets worse with Cain. And it shows us a side of sin that should scare us. And of course, the story just gets worse as you go on toward the flood. But this is the first indication that it's far worse than we thought. I want us to read the first 15 verses of Genesis chapter 4, just to refresh our memory of what's going on here. It says, "Now the man had relations with his wife Eve, and she conceived and gave birth to Cain. And she said, I have gotten a man-child with the help of the Lord. Again, she gave birth to his brother Abel, and Abel was a keeper of flocks, but Cain was a tiller of the ground. So it came about in the course of time that Cain brought an offering to the Lord of the fruit of the ground. Abel on his part also brought of the firstlings of his flock and of their fat portions. And the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering, but for Cain and for his offering he had no regard. So Cain became very angry, and his countenance fell. Then the Lord said to Cain, Why are you angry, and why has your countenance fallen? If you do well, will not your countenance be lifted up? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door, and its desire is for you, but you must master it. Cain told Abel his brother, and it came about when they were in the field that Cain rose up against Abel his brother and killed him. Then the Lord said to Cain, Where is Abel your brother? And he said, I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper? He said, What have you done? The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground. Now you are cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you cultivate the ground, it will no longer yield its strength to you. You will be a vagrant and a wanderer on the earth. Cain said to the Lord, my punishment is too great to bear. Behold, you have driven me this day from the face of the ground, and from your face I will be hidden. And I will be a vagrant and a wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me. So the Lord said to him, therefore, whoever kills Cain, vengeance will be taken on him sevenfold. And the Lord appointed a sign for Cain, that no one finding him would slay him. Now, the first thing we need to notice about this is the hope with which Cain was born. Eve seems to be rejoicing at the birth of her first son. And so here they are exiled from the garden, and bad things have happened as a result of their sin. And she's lamenting all of that. In fact, she lamented those things during her pregnancy with Cain, undoubtedly, because one of her punishments was pain in childbirth. And I don't think that's just the pain of labor. It sort of extends out to everything that childbirth involves. And so she's been pregnant. She understands what it's like to worry about her child. Maybe there were a few things that felt incredibly odd and unnatural to her as she was pregnant with him. And she worried about those things. Maybe she took her concerns to God even, the way that Rebecca would later do when she was pregnant with her boys. And then the pain of childbirth happens, and that had to be terrifying to her. Nobody had ever gone through that. There wasn't anybody who could tell her, that everything was normal and everything was okay. And so she's terrified of what's going to happen to her because of what's going on there. And all of a sudden, Cain pops out. Here she's got her son. And this is not just special to her because she's holding her baby in her arms. It's special to her because of something that God said after she had sinned. In chapter 3, in verse 15, God tells the serpent, with Eve there listening, I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise you on the head, and you shall bruise him on the heel. And so there's going to be this enmity between the seed of the serpent, the wicked, and the righteous, the seed of the woman. And there's going to be such hostility that there's going to be war between human beings and the serpent. And the serpent was going to have somewhat of a victory. He was going to be able to bite the heel of whoever this is, but the serpent's head is going to be crushed by someone. And the only clue that she gets is that it's going to be her descendant that does this, and that her descendant is going to be a male. And so who's going to be this person? Well, could it be Cain? Could he be the one that's going to set right all these things that went wrong? Is he going to be the one that's going to end the pain in childbirth and end the labors that Adam is having to do out in the field to earn food by the sweat of his brow? Is Cain going to be the solution to sin? She doesn't know, but maybe. And so Cain is born with all of this hope surrounding him, and that needs to feed our understanding of what happens later, because when he falls, it's not just that she loses her son. It's not just that her son has gone down into evil. It's that part of her hope has died. How is it exactly that God is going to redeem his people if it's not through this son that was born to her? As the story opens, both brothers bring an offering to the Lord, and that should concern us. It's great that they want to worship God, but there's something in the fact that they are bringing offerings, and especially that Abel is bringing blood offerings to God, that should concern us. And we're not so concerned on Cain's part, because we already know the end of the story. We know he needs to be there. We know he needs to get forgiveness of his sins. But Abel's the righteous one. He's the one that God approves of, isn't he? And yet even he is bringing a sacrifice to God. And that indicates something that maybe we hoped wouldn't be in this story, but it certainly is. And that is that even the righteous one has sinned. Abel needs to get atonement for his sins as well. And think about what they're doing as they're offering these sacrifices to God. You remember the good creation that God made back in chapter 1? Everything was created according to his design, and he looked upon all of it and he pronounced it good. And what did he give to Adam and Eve? He gave them every plant to eat of. And here Abel's bringing blood and he's killing God's good creation in order to atone for his sins. And if the good one is sinning, If sin has even contaminated the good one, then what hope does humanity have? This is a real problem, long before Abel is murdered by his brother. And I'll tell you this, too. What happens next in the story is even more worrisome than that. Cain offers God a sacrifice, and God rejects it. And this tells the pagans something way more than it does us, because I think we understand how this works being Christians. But think about the pagan world. The pagan world worked where you bring your sacrifices to the God, and the God did not care what kind of person you were. Baal doesn't care whether you cheat on your wife or not. Baal doesn't care if you steal a little bit. Baal is completely unconcerned about all those things. He wants his sacrifice. And as long as you give him his sacrifice, then if you give it to him in the right amounts and in the right way, and you follow all the procedures that the priest tells you to do it, then Baal's going to send you rain, and he's going to make sure you have plenty of kids, and he's going to make sure your crops come in, and all these different things. That's all Baal cared about, was the amount of sacrifice that was given. He didn't really even care that much what it was. God's not nearly as concerned with what is brought, but how it is brought. And the what is important, and God's going to set up ways to worship him. And there are going to be rules, especially under the law of Moses, that govern exactly what you were supposed to bring. But that was really only sort of a reflection of the fact that the person was bringing themselves to God, and they were doing it in the right way, with the right faith, and with the right spirit, because they wanted to please God. God requires way more than just payment. If God said, I want $1 million from all of you, and if you give me $1 million, then we'll just forget this sin business, and I'll take care of you forever, and you'll have a good life eternally, and sin won't touch you. It won't have any consequences in your life. Wouldn't that be easier than what he actually requires of us? I mean, I don't know if I'll ever see $1 million or not, but that would be easier to earn, wouldn't it, than what God actually requires of us? Where every day we wake up and we think about the conversation we had with our husband or wife yesterday, and we think about the conversations we had with our sons or our daughters, and we think about what we did with our neighbors, and we think, did I do the right thing? Was I behaving righteously when I said this? I mean, I know I hurt their feelings a little bit, and I didn't intend to. Maybe they needed their feelings hurt. Maybe it was done the right way, but I sure don't like the reaction. And so we just start scrutinizing exactly how we had that conversation. And maybe we even go to them and we try to figure it out. And I mean, it just weighs on us, doesn't it? Constantly, because we want to do what is right. It's not enough just to pay. Paying's easy. Righteousness is not. And God wants righteousness. It's really interesting over in Hebrews chapter 11, and we're going to jump right back to Genesis, so don't leave Genesis unmarked in some way. But in Hebrews chapter 11, God tells us why he rejected Cain and why he accepted Abel. And what's interesting is it's not what we think God is going to say. It says, by faith, Abel offered to God a better sacrifice than Cain, through which he obtained testimony that he was righteous, God testifying about his gifts, and through faith, though he is dead, he still speaks. Now, what we want from that is some detail about why his sacrifice was better. Was it because it was animals instead of vegetables? Was it because he chose the first of his flock, and maybe Cain didn't choose the first of his vegetables or something, or maybe there was some problem in the selection process, and God doesn't bother with any of that. Maybe that's true. We don't know. What we do know is that through those animals and through the choosing process, Abel offered himself to God through those things. And Cain did not offer himself. Whatever it was that was wrong about Cain's sacrifice, if it was the wrong kind of offering or whatever, all that did was reflect the fact that Cain did not have faith in God. He had not given himself to God. Cain was trying to pay God off. And God refuses to be paid off in that way. Micah talks about that in Micah chapter 6. He says, what shall I render to my Lord? And he starts listing things. 10,000 rivers of oil, my firstborn for the sin of my soul. He says, what does God require of man but to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly before his God? Isn't it easier to find the 10,000 rivers? Isn't it easier to go out and sacrifice your firstborn son? The pagans did that. They did it all the time. Didn't think about it. Because it was way easier to offer their children on an altar to Moloch than it was to give themselves to God in righteousness. And that's what God wanted from Cain, and that is what he did not get. And so he rejected his sacrifice. And it's kind of intimidating to realize that God isn't as interested in the sacrifice as he's interested in obtaining us. And that requires a lot from us. It requires the right sacrifice, but it requires so much more. And it's at this point where things get really bad. Cain is angered that God did not accept his sacrifice, and so he directs his anger at his brother. And this is not a momentary anger. This is a long-term anger over an extended period of time. And this should make us a little bit nervous because this is a little different than what we saw in Eden. I don't know if Adam and Eve spent a lot of time around the tree of the knowledge of good and evil thinking about it and everything. They obviously gave it some thought. But you get the impression, especially with all the emphasis that the Bible places on the fact that Eve was deceived, that she wasn't thinking about it all the time. It was more that the serpent showed up at just the right time and started talking to her. And in the course of the conversation, she kind of got confused and she started thinking the wrong way. And the next thing she knows, she's taken the fruit and she's eaten it. And then Adam even, he knows what he's doing. He sinned a lot more willfully than she did, but he didn't really think much about it. Those of us who are men, we kind of know about that, don't we? You just sort of do something without thinking about it, and then you get yourself in trouble. That seems to be what Adam is doing. He knew what he was doing, but he didn't put a lot of thought into it. It was a momentary decision. Cain's wickedness here comes out of a long period of thought. Have you ever been so angry at something that your face couldn't hide it? You ever been so emotional about something, not even anger, that your face couldn't hide it for several days? Some of us may have, forgetting anger for just a second, maybe we were sad for that long. And you just can't hide that. People see you and you may not even be crying, but you're crying 10 minutes ago and they can just kind of look at you and see something's not right. My wife, when she was in college, our dear friend got cancer and she thankfully recovered from that and has been doing great ever since. But it was devastating to find out about that. And my wife went a number of days without eating when she found out about that. You could tell. You look at her. And you could just see how sad she was because of that. And there wasn't any hiding it. And so whatever it was that's going on with Cain, it goes on for so long that he can't hide it anymore. And it can be seen on his face. And God looks at him and he says, well, why is your countenance fallen? And so all this time that Cain was angry before God talked to him, he's got time to sort of stew in that for a little bit. And then there was a period of time after God talked to him where Cain has to decide what decision he's going to make. And so he's still thinking about it. And then he's got to walk with Abel out to the field where he kills him. And so he's got time to think about what he's doing there. This is a long process of contemplating this. And when we think about this and the way that we react to things sometimes, there's a lot about sin that's maybe not fun to contemplate always. Some of it's fun, but a lot of it is very satisfying in some way. Several years ago, I had a little office in San Juan because we were in an apartment at that time and we were kind of running out of room. My daughter had been born and she was constantly walking up to me, kind of, getting in my business while I was trying to work on stuff. And so I thought, well, I need a place outside of the house. We didn't want to buy a house. I just get me a little office and rent it cheap and work from there. So I had that office and somebody broke into it one day and they stole some stuff I had in there. $300 or $400 I lost, I guess. And I wasn't so worried about the money value of what I lost as much as this person broke into my space and they kind of violated this spot that I enjoyed being. And I remember for days after that, I would find myself, and it wasn't even a conscious thing, but I'd constantly be thinking, what if I were in here when they broke in and I had a gun? And after a few times of that thought popping into my head, I thought, I got to do something about this. This is not the right way to go. And so I figured out some ways to kind of help myself get over that. But I'll tell you what, the few times I had that thought, it was mighty satisfying. It wasn't the right thought to have, but it was a very satisfying thought because it gave me control in my imagination over a situation I didn't have any control over. That was what was satisfying about it. And so in my little fantasy, I could play out the situation just how I liked it so that everything turned out okay. And when I didn't want to do violence to the person, I worked it out to where I just intimidated him. So he went off and did something else, And, I played that thing out several times in my mind before I finally realized this is just not a healthy way to go. It was a satisfying thought because I got to win. And here Cain's having the same kind of thought. And God says, Cain, you can't be thinking like that. This is going to lead to bad things. Doesn't matter how satisfying it is. It's going to lead to ruin. And so you've got to make a decision about what to do. By having this thought, Cain was really trying to blame Abel for his sins. Cain places all the blame on Abel, and he's not blaming Abel because Abel did something that was good and, because he had pushed Cain somehow into doing something evil. He was blaming Abel because Abel was the evidence that Cain had not done what was right. Sometimes people blame us for things, and maybe we deserve a little bit of the blame. Maybe we encouraged them to make a decision that got them in big trouble, and so they blame us, and rightly so. We kind of pushed them into it. But Abel didn't push Cain into anything. Abel didn't really even care, other than just through brotherly concern, exactly what kind of sacrifice Cain brought or with what spirit he brought it. Abel is there at the altar of God because he wants to worship the Lord. But every time Cain looks at Abel, he sees judgment because God accepted Abel. And that meant that God accepted somebody. And if God accepts somebody, then he could have accepted me, Cain's thinking, but he didn't, which means I did something wrong. And Cain cannot live with that. And so he puts the blame on Abel, and he's got to eliminate this guy who just by living and walking around him is a constant judge of him. That's kind of like Genesis chapter 3 and verse 12, isn't it? In Genesis 3, you got Adam and Eve in the garden, and God confronts Adam about his sin, and the man said, the woman whom you gave me to be with me, she gave me from the tree, and I ate. And the Lord said to the woman, what is it you have done? And the woman said, well, the serpent deceived me, and I ate. And they're just constantly passing the blame to the other person, right? Or to the other serpent. They don't want the blame. And so they're trying to set somebody else up as the real cause of this because they don't want the blame themselves. And that's all Cain is trying to do with Abel. He's trying to put the blame on him for something that Cain knew that he himself had done wrong. And so God intervenes. And he tells Cain he's not doing well. He says, you need to do well in order to be accepted. Cain, you have control over this. And that's also something that, we really, I don't think want to hear, right? Because that puts responsibility on us. When God tells us you can control whether you do what is right or not, that means I've got to make a decision. I can't sit here and blame my brother. I can't blame my mom and my dad. I can't blame somebody else. I can't even blame the serpent. The blame rests on me. And God goes further. And God tells Cain that sin is waiting on him at the door, crouching down, hunting him, and that Cain was going to have to somehow get control of that wild animal. He's going to have to keep the door shut. He was going to have to make sure that that animal did not get to him. Now, that's kind of a terrifying illustration if you think about it. We're not too accustomed to being around animals that hunt us. There are plenty of animals around here that could do us harm if they wanted to. You don't want to corner a coyote. You don't want to corner, a panther or something like that. But there are very few animals that actually hunt humans actively. Bears don't really do that other than grizzlies. We don't have any of those out here, And so when you step out your front door, you're usually pretty safe. Nobody steps out their front door thinking, is there a wild animal out here that's about to get me? But what if there was? And what if they were hunting you? And they were just sitting out there waiting on you to open the door. That's a terrifying thought. And God says, that's what sin is, Cain. I'll tell you what, that makes you think, doesn't it? Because when I open my front door and I go out to my car and I go out to the mall or I go out to visit somebody or I go out to, interact with the city of San Juan, there's opportunities for sin all over the place. And so when I open my door, there's all kinds of wild animals out there waiting on me. Do we sense that kind of danger with sin? Do we think about it that way? Or when we open our front door, do we just go out kind of naively thinking that everything's just going to be normal today and Satan's going to take the day off and we're not going to have any trouble? We need to think about where our weaknesses are and what we're going to experience when we leave our front door, even when we stay in our house, to be honest. Because what we're opening is not the front door, it's the door of our soul, and we're opening it up to temptation. And we need to make sure that we guard that door. And that we make sure that that wild animal can't get into us. Cain opened that door. And what's interesting is just like his parents, the animal didn't immediately kill him. It just did its work slowly over time. Cain thought about it a lot between the time that God warns him about this and the time that he kills Abel. Even that walk out to the field is just this amount of time that he has to contemplate what's going on in his mind. And he just allows that animal to keep working on him until finally Cain, and all the brotherly affection he had for Abel and all the connection he had to his family and all the connection he had to God, was gone. And he rises up against Abel. And the Hebrew text there is interesting. It doesn't just translate to killed necessarily. You can translate that word butchered. I mean, he took out his entire amount of anger, all of his vengeance on his brother, and he brutally killed him because he hated him. There's no reluctance on Cain's part that we see. There doesn't seem to be really any remorse. And what's interesting about that is you could think about it in terms of Cain actually dying first before Abel, can't you? Because Abel has his brother lying in wait for him. His brother tricks him to go out in the field. And Abel dies at the hand of his brother. But before Abel died at the hand of his brother, Cain opened that door and he let that wild animal of sin get at him. And it killed him. It took him. And then he killed his brother. And so Cain died first. And sin took every ounce of love he had for God and love he had for his brother and other human beings away. And the Cain that killed Abel was not even the Cain that just kind of halfway thought that maybe he ought to bring a sacrifice to God, though not with full faith. He had devolved from there. And so that's a scary thought, that sin can take us that far. And not only that sin can take us that far, but that while God is willing to work with us and to help us overcome sin, if we're determined for sin to take us, he'll let it. He'll sit back and he'll watch it do it. And he'll give us the way out if we'll take it. But if we refuse, then if we end up butchered by sin, it's because we made the wrong decisions, not God. You think about the rich young ruler in this aspect. He comes to Jesus and he says, "What must I do to inherit eternal life?" And Jesus says, "Well, you know the commandments, and in addition to those, sell everything that you have and come follow me." And he goes away sorrowful. And what does Jesus do? Does he run after him and say, "Come back"? No. Okay, not all of your possessions. I didn't really mean that. Pick the 10 or 15 most precious possessions, and you don't have to give those up, but just sell everything else. He turns to his disciples. He turns his back on the rich young ruler as he's walking away, and he uses it as an opportunity to teach his disciples about how dangerous riches are. And he let him go. God will let us go if we are determined to go. And he let Cain go, not without a warning. And so at the end of the day, Cain cannot say, God did not try. But what he does have to admit is, it's my fault that I'm suffering the things that I am. God confronts Cain again. And this time it's not about his anger, it is about the murder of his brother. And he asks him, where is Abel, your brother? Now that is again an echo back to chapter 3, isn't it? What does God ask Adam and Eve when he goes after them? He says, where are you? And just like Adam and Eve had hidden themselves from the presence of God, it's interesting that there's kind of a step in the wrong direction for Cain, because Cain does not hide himself from God. He hides the evidence of his sin. And so Cain doesn't seem to be ashamed whatsoever to try to stand before God on his own 2 feet and try to defend himself and act like everything's okay. But he doesn't really want to talk about what he's done because he knows it's wrong. And so he'll stand before God, but he hides the evidence. It's the biggest moment of hypocrisy in the entire story. His brother is lying hidden and dead, and Cain is standing there acting like everything's okay. He responds and he says, I do not know, am I my brother's keeper? And both of those statements reveal a lot about Cain. I do not know, well, that's a lie. He knows exactly where he's disposed of his brother's body. I suppose there may be just a little bit of truth in that, though, because what Cain does not know is that God is still protecting Abel. Abel is listed among the righteous in Hebrews 11, and he's mentioned in the number of those who are going to be given their reward, not apart from us. Abel is safe with God, and Abel will have his reward, and I'm not sure that Cain fully understands that yet. He did not eliminate the problem. Not only did he not eliminate the problem, but Abel's perfectly okay, and Abel is still being blessed by God, and Abel is still judging Cain by his righteousness, even by being dead. But Cain does know where the body is, and he acts like he doesn't. And he also says, am I my brother's keeper? And that's a really strange response, isn't it? What would happen to any of us if somebody came to you and they said, your brother's missing, your sister's missing, your son, your daughter, they're missing. We don't know where they are. We hadn't seen them for 3 days. What would you do? I mean, I don't like thinking about that, actually. I've thought about that a little bit with regard to my daughters, and that's just a thought I kind of have to push away because the idea of that is just horrifying to me. But I can get sort of a sense of just how far my heart would drop just to hear those words. And then what do? You go to the places where they might be and you search for them and you put out all points bulletins and you do all these things trying to figure out where in the world they are. And it's not well, why are you asking me? I don't have any responsibility for them. Of course you have responsibility for them. If you love them at all, you have responsibility for them. Cain, once again, has shredded all of his love for his brother, all of his love for God, all of his love for humanity. And what he is now is an egocentric tyrant. And like all tyrants, 2 things happen to him. First thing is, he tries to control everything. He has to control whether God accepts his brother's sacrifice. He has to control whether his brother lives or dies. He has to control how his brother lives or dies. He has to control where the evidence is hidden. He has to control how God views his current conversation. He tries to control everything, and just like every tyrant in the history of this world, he ends up losing control of it. And he gets to a point where as a human being, he can no longer control the situation that he is in. And he realizes at the moment God says, your brother's blood's crying to me from the ground. That's kind of a almost humorous picture to imagine. Not the murder necessarily, but what would happen if when something like that happened, blood could actually scream? If blood could scream, murderers wouldn't choose to murder, would they? Because the minute that you put the knife in, the minute that you shoot them with a bullet or whatever, all of a sudden everybody's going to know the alarm's going off. And Cain didn't think blood could scream, but it could to God. God knew exactly where Abel was. And there was actually a message in Abel's righteous blood. And it was twofold. One was that Abel, dying as a righteous man, demands justice. And God is going to get it for him. And so his blood is screaming for God to intervene and for God to punish Cain and for Cain to realize how badly he had made a mistake. And on the other hand, Abel's blood is screaming for God to help him because he did his best to please God. And if this life was all that there was, then Abel dies and unjustly receives just murder and death and destruction and nothing else. And God says, I'm not going to let that happen either. I'm going to protect Abel even beyond this life, and I'm going to make sure that he has a better resurrection. And so his blood cried out, and Cain found out that there was no way to hide what he had done. God punished Cain with exile, same way he had punished his parents. Adam and Eve are kicked out of the Garden of Eden. Cain is sent away from most of the rest of humanity. We know he has a wife. We know he's eventually going to have children and descendants. And so there were certain people that would associate with Cain, but the vast majority of people would not. Because, again, like all tyrants, there's a cycle to this thing. When you try to control something so badly, you're able to hang on to it for just a while, and then you lose control over it. And the minute that you lose control over it, all the people that are around you that you've been trying to control, they find out who you are, and they turn on you too. And so you can look at this almost in a twofold way. God is directly punishing Cain with exile, and he's telling him where to go. At the same time, God's also punishing him indirectly. God is not only telling him, get out of here, go away from all of humanity, but God has built certain punishments into the way the world works. And as Cain goes into exile, it's just natural that nobody's going to want to be around the person who will take human life when they feel so inclined. And so the natural consequence to sin is exile many, many times. When Cain realized that not only was he going to be in exile, but also that he was not going to be able to till the ground and get its fruit, his response is, my punishment is greater than I can bear. I think that's something not only that Cain sensed immediately, but I think it's something he sensed more and more and more over time. How long does he have to live in exile before he begins to realize that it's way worse than even what he thought? How long does he have to try to get food through great difficulty? And then after several years of trying this and just barely subsisting, does he realize it's even worse than what he thought? And sin will take us to that place too, won't it? Where initially we're ashamed and we're disgraced, but the longer we persist in it without repenting, and sometimes the longer we have to face the consequences of sins that we just can't escape regardless of repentance, we realize we never should have done what we did, because it's reaping consequences that we never even imagined that we would have to face. In exile, Cain builds the first walled city. If you look at chapter 4 and verse 17, it says, Cain had relations with his wife, and she conceived and gave birth to Enoch. And he built a city and called the name of the city Enoch after the name of his son. Now to Enoch was born Irad, and Irad became the father of Mehujael, and it's just a long genealogy of Cain's descendants here that eventually populated this city. And it's kind of interesting that he builds a walled city, because why do you build a walled city? You build a walled city to keep people out, not to let people in. And so who's Cain trying to keep out? It seems to be that he's trying to keep out those that he doesn't trust earlier in the text when he tells God, anyone who will find me will kill me. And God says, Cain, don't worry, I'm going to place a mark on you, and people will understand that I have marked you for mercy, and they won't kill you. And it doesn't seem like Cain trusts that. And that's a really sad thing. Because what we would hope is that after all of this, after God has constantly intervened with Cain, mercy after mercy after mercy, that Cain would finally get the impression that maybe God's trying to help him here, and maybe trusting God is the answer after all. And it doesn't seem like Cain ever learned that. And so not only is he exiled by God, not only does all the rest of humanity kind of separate themselves from Cain because they don't want to be around a murderer, but Cain walls himself off. And Cain is just as much the cause of his exile as God and the rest of humanity are. Because that's another thing sin will do to us, is it will just exile us in our own mind to where we're consumed by it. And we can't have relationships with other people. And it's not just that they reject us, though they will. It's that we reject them and we can't be around them because we're too consumed by our own egocentricity, our own pride, our own love for self and for our own desires rather than love for them. And we just grow farther and farther away from the rest of humanity. You think about that in contrast with Abel. Abel goes to the altar, and Abel really has control over one thing. He doesn't have control over anything else. Abel can't control whether Cain is going to like what he offers or not. Abel cannot control whether Cain is going to kill him or not. He can't control, whether his death is avenged or not. If he ends up dying. There's so much about this that Abel has absolutely no control over at all. But he can control whether he offers his sacrifice in faith or not. And so he takes that one thing that God's given him to control. Abel, you can humble yourself before God. You can bring not just the right type of sacrifice, but you can bring the right heart to your worship. And if you do that, then God will take care of the rest. And he will take care of the rest whether your righteousness ends up in a long, happy life lived with great earthly blessings by the hand of God, or whether your righteousness results in your murder. God will take care of you because you control the one little thing that you had control over, which is, am I going to put my faith in God or not? It's scary sometimes how little we control in this world. We look at all these things that are going on, and we don't get to control whether the U.S. goes to war with Iran or not. We don't get to control all the stuff that's happening in, Israel and Palestine. We don't get to control the Russia-Ukraine conflict. We don't get to control things like, immigration. We don't get to control decisions that are made in high places about things that affect our investments and our retirement. We don't get to control so much stuff. We go to the doctor every time hoping that we get good news, but we don't have all the control we'd like to have over that. And so we try to eat healthy and we try to exercise and we try to do all the things that are going to keep us healthy. And cancer happens and heart disease happens and you can't always control all that stuff. We have so little we can control. But the one thing God has given us control over is absolutely everything, which is, are we going to put our faith in him or not? And if we do that, he can take care of us no matter what the cancer does to us. And he can take care of us no matter what the heart disease does to us. And he can take care of us whether, we win the war in Iran or not, whether we lose the war in Iran or not, whether the whole world rises up against the United States and we suddenly find ourselves overpowered, or whether we dominate the world. None of it matters because we've made the right decision with regard to our faith. And all the rest of that is beyond our control. It's in God's hands. But we'll be just fine because we put our faith in our Creator, the living God. When we think about Cain and the mistakes that he made, we need to realize that sin will take us places we don't want to go. Cain did not go to God to offer a sacrifice in order to kill his brother and in order to be cursed by God. He did not start it that way. If he figured that he was already cursed by God, he never would have been at the altar. But that's where it ended up, isn't it? And Cain thought that he could entertain sinful thoughts without them becoming sinful actions, and he was wrong about that, and we need to be careful about that. We need to ask ourselves what kind of thoughts I'm having, because those will eventually be actions if we have them long enough. And we need to make sure that we control our thoughts, because out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. And out of our heart determines whether we bear good fruit or bad fruit. And so the heart cultivates all of that stuff. And we need to be careful how we think. We need to realize how dangerous sin is. We're walking out into our world every day with constant dangers crouching around us, trying to take our lives. And we can protect ourselves from that, but it takes conscious decisions and it takes intentionality in our faith. And so what decisions are we making every morning before we walk out the door? How are we planning our day? Are we planning righteousness? Or are we just hoping that it happens? We need to realize that if we are struggling with relationships, if we're struggling with love for others, if we're struggling with them loving us, that somewhere in the mix, maybe coming out of us if we're not careful, is some sort of sin, because that's what kills relationships between people. And to the extent that we can expunge sin from our lives and cast it out, we will find the love of our fellow man to increase 1,000-fold. Our marriages will be better. Our relationships with our kids will be better. Our relationships with our neighbors will be better, because we made decisions to not sin and to not cloud our view of other people by it. We need to be careful that we don't start putting up walls that God didn't build. God didn't put Cain in that city. Cain built his own walls. And we need to realize that everything God did for Cain was an attempt to try to get Cain back to where he needed to be, and Cain just kept moving the other way. And so if we're making bad decisions, let's not wall ourselves in. Let's not put ourselves in a position where we can't be reached. Let's open our lives up to our brethren who want to help us. Let's open our lives up to Christ, who will examine every detail of us and tell us where we're wrong. Let's open our lives up to our family who love us and will point out our flaws if we let them. And let's just cleanse ourselves and use the love of Christ and the love of our brethren to become truly righteous people. If you're here this morning and you need to respond to the gospel, we want to encourage you to do that. If you need to be baptized into Christ, we can definitely help you with that, and we want to see you begin your walk with the Lord. I encourage everyone here who is thinking about repentance to follow through with it. Whether you come forward or not, go to one of your brethren, confess your sins to them, seek help so that you don't end up like Cain, and so that you end up with great faith in God like Abel had. God will protect you and God will bless you for it. If you need to respond to the gospel in any way, we want to encourage you to do that now as we stand and sing. Transition.